educational workshops. Today we've got real estate, the pulse of the real estate industry, and with us today are Seth Ben Ezra of Ben Ezra Law, a company that handles hundreds, if not thousands, of commercial and real estate closings each year, along with Alex McPherson, a banker with 25 years experience in helping guide borrowers through purchasing or refinancing properties. So welcome, Seth and Alex.
Thanks, Jamie.
Just for the rest of you, feel free at any time if you want to raise your hand to ask a question or just reach out and ask. So let's start off right off the bat, and that is, what should buyers and sellers be aware of when buying or selling a home?
That's a big question. So it really depends a lot on where they are and what they're buying, right? So out here on the island, single family house, during the pandemic, one of the things that changed dramatically was that buyers and sellers were buyers. So let's go with buyers first. Buyers were put under pressure to not get inspections and to waive their mortgage contingencies, which makes somebody like Alex completely crazy and makes his job hard to do. So with no inspection, it means that if Alex sees something on the banking side that poses a challenge for him to be able to lend, there's really not much he can do about it because the contract won't be subject to it. And without a mortgage contingency, it also puts the banker under pressure because they've got no leeway, no way to protect the buyer. So post-COVID, we all heard it was going to be better for buyers. The challenge is there isn't really inventory. So all the sellers who were out there who needed to sell or wanted to sell and make a killing did it during COVID. Very, very little inventory, which means buyers are still under pressure, even though rates have tripled from where they were at the bottom of the pandemic, right in the middle of the pandemic. So for buyers, I'm going to jump in and Alex will follow up on this, I'm sure, is make sure you're prepared financially. Jamie and I know a young couple who thought they were doing the right thing, paid down all of their student debt, worked their tails off to make sure that they had terrific finances going into getting their mortgage. But they did something that's probably Alex's worst nightmare, is they had no cash in the bank. And they were savers, they were responsible. So we tell people, just keep your finances status quo. Don't change anything. Don't lease cars. Don't purchase furniture. Don't do anything that's going to impact the bank while they're looking through your finances. So Alex, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'd say just, let's start with a 10,000-foot view. For those of you who don't know me well, I've both underwritten and originated both residential and commercial lending. So one of the few who've kind of done a little bit of both. I think, Seth touched on a couple of things that I really focus on with anybody I'm having discussion. And there's two kind of overriding principles that I look at in helping people. One is being properly prepared, knowing what you're getting yourself into. And the second one is working with the right people. And I think, the things that Seth just mentioned is that there's a few that frighten me up front. It's one is my friend told me to do this, or two is my Uncle Joey is an attorney and he's going to be handling everything for me.
Yep. The divorce guy.
Yeah. So again, some of these might seem like a little more on the common sense sort of approach, but a large part of that is understanding what's fact from fiction. There's an amazing amount of misinformation that's floating around, with the way that we live now and everything being digital, and anybody who wants to put a podcast or some sort of, call it, information piece out there can get in front of someone and tell them this is real and it may not be. Or they could be missing a scenario that doesn't really fit to what that other individual is looking to accomplish. So I think those are some key things to making sure, especially with, residential properties. If you look at the majority of Americans, the majority of their wealth is built into their house. I think that's an overreaching kind of, if you want to call it, with most Americans. I mean, obviously business owners, things like that are, might have some differences, but when you boil it down, most people's wealth is a big portion of that is their house. And the largest financial transaction they're probably ever going to do is either purchasing or refinancing a property. So if you're not prepared, or you think you can kind of half-ass it through, it may work, but again, if that's the largest financial transaction you're probably ever going to do, or at least have done up until that point of your life, let's make sure you're at least prepared properly and asking some good questions before you sign all the papers, or before you select the lender that you're dealing with, I think is of utmost importance. And
I'm
I
gonna take
can't
it-
stress that enough.
I'm going to take it back a step because that's enormous. And it's, we talked about things that we would talk about during this, and that is probably you just hit on the thing that causes the most frustration and heartache. I got a call yesterday from a couple up in Boston, reasonably wealthy, upper middle class couple, $1 million in the bank that they use to buy a property for their kid in Manhattan. And they're calling me now after they closed to try and answer all the questions that weren't answered along the way. And part of the challenge is they took advice from interested parties around them. So they got their attorney from the realtor. They didn't know the realtor from a hole in the wall. The realtor was, I think, maybe on the website for the building that they bought because it was new construction. So they had interested parties along the way. So they didn't, on the bright side, they didn't use the, as we joke about, the mother's, uncle's, sister's, best friend's divorce attorney. They used a real estate attorney, but someone who was sort of beholden to the realtors. So they got no answers. They had no information. New construction condo in Brooklyn. These 6-7 unit buildings are very difficult to work in. They didn't understand the tax structure. They didn't understand the 421A abatements and whether or not it would be granted. They didn't understand the timeframes. They didn't understand the how the punch list and follow up to the construction would work. So they're a mess. And they were given bad advice in terms of how to properly title the unit. So they have the unit in 2 trusts, and their son, who's, I'll say a third owner because they didn't even delineate how to hold title. So what Alex was saying is really critical. Get your ducks in a row first. So we find that young couples, especially out here and in the city, are thrust into the purchase process. They're told that everything has to be urgent, instant. You've got to jump. You don't have time for questions. You're going to lose this deal. They need to slow down, ask the questions of the professionals around them, interview the professionals around them, get the right people. Don't just go to Alex as somebody said he's great. Get him on the phone and ask him, hey, what do you do? How many of these have you done? Have you closed in this area? What problems have you seen? Where can you help us? What advice do you have? Same thing for attorneys. Obviously, we've been doing this since 1994, starting to get the hang of it. And we learn stuff every single day. It's a lot to ask. And the way the transactions are happening now is it's a little better than COVID, but they're still being forced to do things much quicker than they should. And like Alex said, hopefully it's not, but for most people, it's the single biggest transaction by multiples, in the tenfold that you'll do in your whole life, right? If you're fortunate enough to buy a $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 car, all right, an $800,000 house is really not a big stretch. It's 10 times the next biggest transaction you're going to make. And young couples now in their late 20s, early 30s are buying houses that are $700,000 or $800,000 that are starter homes. So it can really impact what happens to you for, I don't want to say the rest of your life, but for a long way to come. So for sellers, just a quick note. So a lot of us are of the age now where we know people who are selling their houses and downsizing or moving to Florida. One of the things that sellers don't do is they don't really take a minute to assess where they are with their house. So one of the things that we find is a seller will come to you as the seller. The seller's attorney prepares the contract. We ask our clients, do you have open permits or COs or anything like that, certificates of occupancy? They often don't know. And they'll just tell you that's how they bought the house, 15, 20, 30 years ago. Buyer's attorneys, particularly if they're not seasoned real estate attorneys, often wait to order a title report until their buyer has a mortgage commitment, which is old school and crazy, right? It used to be that the attorneys were afraid they'd get a charge from their title company if the deal fell apart, which means now if you've got a 45-day mortgage contingency, you're waiting 30, 40, 45, maybe 50 days into the transaction to order a title report, which is then going to take a week or 2 to come back, and then another week or 2 for a survey. So now I'm 60 to 70 days into a transaction when everybody's planning on moving, relocating, getting their kids in school. When I'm first finding out as the seller's attorney from the buyer's title company that I have an open mortgage from 1972 from a company that went out of business, or an open permit for a boiler from 1970 that nobody cared about, or a CO for a garage that was never done. Now I've got to scramble to try and get through a town that's still, having difficulty because of COVID, right? They're still working through Zoom, or Suffolk County was hacked. And now I may need months to go start tracking down things. And if they haven't used a real estate attorney, forget it. Then they don't even know where to go to start tracking things down. So for sellers, really important, get your ducks in a row long before you are looking at selling. You can order a quick title search. You can do a FOIL request through the town. Get your records from the building department and find out. So what sellers tend to say when the shit hits the fan and they're like, oh my God, I didn't know I had an open permit for my basement, second bedroom, extended kitchen. They said, well, I bought the house that way. And one of our unfortunate favorite things to say is, yeah, when you buy a used car and you get pulled over on the way home from the dealership and the cop opens the trunk and says, is that your pound of cocaine? You go, no, 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 I bought the car that way. It's not mine. Same challenge with the house. It is what it is. And people didn't care. Your attorney didn't care. 70s, 80s, early 90s, I'll say, maybe even later than that. Nobody cared about the open permit for the basement or the boiler or the garage converted to living space. And if you don't read your contract well, so if your buyer's attorney is not a real estate attorney and they haven't really scrubbed through the contract, most sellers have clauses that are pretty vicious. I'll say they're brutal in that they exclude the seller's obligations to get certificates of occupancy for a lot of things, pools, decks, sheds, fences that are not on the line, all that sort of stuff. Those cause absolute nightmares. Now, while they're causing a nightmare for the seller, somebody in Alex's shoes is stuck because the buyer didn't do anything wrong. And Alex is like, hey man, we locked you for 45 or 60 days on your rate lock and rates have gone up. It's now really expensive to relock you, maybe so much so that you don't qualify anymore. And I'll stop talking and let Alex jump in there.
Yeah, I would have to kind of echo some of those sentiments. And, let's use last year's rate increase as a perfect example. We actually had this happen with a couple clients, one who signed a contract to buy a 2-family home in Brooklyn. Let's just use round numbers. Say it was $2 million purchase. They locked in, it was new construction. Punch list comes up and they go, what does that mean? How do we get permits? And Brooklyn, permitting is not something that happens quickly. So we locked them in for 90 days, extended them for another 30 days at no charge. And at that point said, we can't extend the rate anymore. It's just too expensive to do it. And he said, can I pay fees to do it? And the fees, let's call it $60,000 in extra fees to maintain the rate. It wasn't palatable, but his rate went from 2.75 to 5.5. So you're talking doubling his interest costs for the year. And Seth mentioned before, do you qualify now? And as a lender, if property values are sort of increasing and interest rates are going up, you sort of have that, what makes sense to still do. And if you, for those of us who were around when 07 and 08 happened, it's called the pendulum that I like to explain it as. So lenders get really greedy and everybody's making a lot of money and the pendulum swings one way and they're going to be a little more forgiving on structure and terms and things are going well and everybody's happy and making money, to things are tightening up, current environment that we're in, a little less liquidity in the market. People are being a little more choosy on structures and loan to values and what do I want to do? Do I want to do a loan in this property in this area? It causes issues. And just to kind of put those into dollars and cents, let's just use an example. $500,000 loan. You own the property, your interest rate you locked in is 2.75. Ballpark, you're paying about a little over $2,000 a month in interest costs. Principal and interest, excuse me, excluding taxes, insurance, those things are going to pretty much be what they are. If you're looking to refinance or just buy that same loan in a property with a $500,000 mortgage now, you're paying roughly $3,160 a month. So you're almost not quite doubling your payment, but coming pretty close. So what does that mean from a qualifying standpoint? So when banks look at this, and this is again a big part of being prepared, is understanding how they actually qualify people. So they want your housing payment to be roughly 30% of your gross income before taxes and other expenses being taken out. That increase in interest rates equates to you needing to have roughly more than $45,000 more in income to qualify, just based on that rate change.
Or you have to find a cheaper, smaller house while house prices are still going up.
Or put more money down that you may or may not have. Again, it changes the math. And I think that's sort of that shock to the market of, and again, I always find it comical when they say starter homes are, $600,000-$700,000. That's sort of a mind-blowing thing, but that's a reality because there isn't a ton of inventory to choose from. My wife and I's first experience looking at starter homes, let's call it quote unquote, was back in 2005. And we were looking at one in Westchester, which again, call the realtor what they want. I look at things of what am I comfortable paying versus what can I max out all of my life savings and income and pay. It's not the same thing. And I think the realtor is driven on pushing the property and getting the sale done and getting paid versus putting you in the right property that you can actually pay for. She showed us a house that literally had the basement was dirt with rocks, very large rocks. And she told me, oh, you can just, fix it up and you can lift the house and do it. And I'm thinking the math in my head, I'm like, we're talking a couple $100,000, even if I can get the permitting and I can't live in the house while they're doing all that. You've got to be out of your mind. Like you can't even put a washing machine down there because the floor all kind of goes like this with giant rocks. And that was the starter home. And that one was $600,000 at that point. I mean, it's again, you have to have that mindset of knowing what you're comfortable with from a financing standpoint, biting off. If you want to look at it as here's what I can qualify for versus this is the part I call the sleep at night factor of knowing if my mortgage is X, I can still cover it if the proverbial crap hits the fan and I either don't have a job or my spouse and I combine, one of us doesn't have a job or wants to take time off with a family or whatever the case might be. Where is that comfort zone now? Because again, everyone else is getting that, let's get excited and buy the house. And that's sort of the American dream, is to own your own home versus not getting yourself into a place that you can't dig out of. And I think, again, being smart with that.
One of the things that changes, I think, from the young couple, particularly their ability to move at their pace and make the right decision is actually, and this is going to sound, it may sound not as important as it is having their team lined up before. So all too often what happens is couples just start looking right there online and they're looking for houses. They grab the realtors that come up on the side of the page, whether it's, however the advertising scheme works, where they start with a realtor. They're everything that they have, and this isn't to besmirch realtors, some are true professionals and some aren't. But what happens then is they're guided by someone, first of all, who represents the seller, even if it's really not the listing agent, if it's the selling agent, the agent that works with the buyer, they still get paid based on the sale price of the house and whether or not it closes. So if you're taking your guidance from the realtor as the gatekeeper, everyone that you get from there on your team sort of has a different interest than yours maybe at heart. So one of the really important things for people, and it's very hard for us and frustrating as lawyers and as mortgage bankers and brokers, is to have the first crack at dealing with potential buyers and even sellers. So when we have buyers that are referred by family or friends, it's easier because we get to talk to them months before they are in the process of buying a house, and we can explain all this to them without the pressure of a realtor running around showing them houses. And it probably changes the experience for them more than anything else, is having their team lined up. So they can be qualified, right, Alex? You can qualify them as buyers before they even find a house. They can be completely underwritten and ready to go, not just with a crappy pre-approval letter. We joke that you can, I can get you a pre-approval letter tomorrow to buy the Empire State Building. It's basically worthless. But if they've gone and sat with Alex, he can literally look at everything, run their credit, look at their numbers, look at their expenses and say, okay, look, you can legitimately afford this. I can have you underwritten and ready to go, subject to collateral, which is subject to finding a house. You can afford $600,000 if the taxes are $15,000 or less, and your insurance is this, at $550,000, you're totally comfortable, and they can be ready to go. Then it just changes the process. It changes the amount of pressure that they feel under.
And there's a big distinction with different lenders on what they mean by pre-approved. So pre-qualified, pre-approved, some of those use those kind of interchangeably. They're not the same thing. Me giving you, like you having a discussion with me on the phone and the back of a napkin, I say, yeah, that kind of works. Versus in writing, you're pre-approved this dollar amount for this loan, subject to an appraisal, title report, and a clean property. That's a different animal. And I think a lot of people don't realize that most cases you're not locking in an interest rate on one of those loans until you have a signed contract. So even if you see, rates are moving or whatever the case might be, It's rare that you would find a lender who will let you lock in without a signed contract. And again, those things are kind of outlined as to what's in the contract. Is there any contingency that if the appraisal, the title, any inspection reports come back saying that there's some sort of issue, that you can get your deposit back or not have to fight them in court over it? So again, you know, this you'll hear a lot of these comments sort of circling back to that same sort of principle that we started with, is understanding what you're getting yourself into, and understanding that you need to be properly prepared.
Yeah, I want to bring up a quick topic. All cash, right? So out here, particularly throughout the pandemic, Manhattan, it's a big thing. A little easier now in Manhattan because of the turbulence in the market there. But out here, you'll have realtors who will try to press buyers to make an all cash offer. All cash is never, very rarely all cash. So what all cash means is just that they're asking you to sign a contract not subject to a mortgage. So there's two really confusing sets of terms that go on for any of you who have kids buying houses, or if you guys are in the market yourself, or no family or friends. Two things that come up that are problems: the cash offer and down payment, right? So as far as the cash offer, really important for the realtors to understand that if you're making an offer that is not subject to a mortgage, it should be written and submitted as a non-contingent offer, meaning it's an offer that's not contingent on financing. Doesn't mean that you don't plan to get financing. And in fact, for most people that make all cash offers, it's because hopefully they've sat with somebody like Alex, and Alex has said, I am 100% positive there is no possibility that you won't qualify if you fit these parameters, right? So as long as they stay in those guidelines, house price, tax amount, and insurance, this is what they can afford. As long as the house appraises, they'll get their mortgage. So that's okay then to be non-contingent. Still scary. You still risk your deposit if you can't get a mortgage for some reason, which could be related to the house. So maybe Alex says, look, you guys are totally qualified, $750 purchase, $15,000 in taxes, no problem. But the house has an open permit, or the house has an illegal basement, or it has, I don't know, whatever it could be. It's relatively uncommon that the bank just flat out won't lend. But it also depends very much what's in the contract. And again, with contracts happening super fast, and no restriction on what type of lawyer can negotiate a contract, you end up with situations where the contract doesn't protect the buyer, right? So now an open permit for something, and the seller says, hey man, I don't care. We knew the basement was illegal, and it says in the contract we don't have to get you a CO for it, or the garage conversion. And if the bank has a problem with it, you are sunk if it is a non-contingent transaction. So all cash, very different. All cash is genuinely when you are coming to the table with your own money, and very often the contract will actually prohibit you from getting a mortgage. So that means that you're stuck pulling out money after the fact. It's terms that get thrown around by realtors as if they don't mean anything. They actually mean quite a bit. The other thing I just wanted to throw out there is down payment. Realtors are actually trained to use the term down payment in reference to the amount of funds the buyer is putting into a transaction. Okay, so if you're borrowing 80% and you're putting 20% of your own funds into the transaction, the realtors call that a down payment. It's not a down payment. Okay, that is just your cash contribution to the transaction. It's actually not even an accurate number, right? So if you're borrowing 80% and you're putting down 20% of your own money, it's probably about 25 or 26% because of the closing costs, escrows for taxes, insurance, all the other things that go into it. We actually give people a calculation of all of their closing costs. Jamie, you saw it for what we just did with the couples that we worked with. They get a closing cost estimate from us right off the bat with everything they're going to need to come to the closing table. So as Alex will see all the time, he's not just qualifying you to make sure you have enough cash for the other 20%. There's another 5 or 6% more, not just closing costs, but your tax escrow, right? In Nassau and Suffolk County, there's about 9 months of taxes that will go into an escrow account between your bank, your title company, and how much money you owe back the seller if they've paid taxes already. That could be huge. That's another, $10, $12, $13, $14,000 added to closing costs, which not everybody will tell you is a closing cost because it's not controlled, right? It's just something that's due at closing. So a lot of times you're not prepared for it. So anyway, the down payment part though, the down payment is how much money you're actually putting on contract with the seller's attorney as leverage, basically, to force you to come to the closing table. So if I'm buying a house for $600,000 and getting a $480,000 mortgage, right, which is an 80% mortgage, my down payment is not the difference between those two. My down payment is typically 10%. It can be as easily as low as 5%. It can technically be what's referred to in the old case law as a peppercorn, right? It can be my favorite pen, right? As long as there's bargained for consideration and exchange that's meaningful to me, if the seller is willing to hold this because it means so much to me and they think I won't walk away from the transaction, this pen can be my down payment. So just really important to keep in mind. And the down payment is what you risk if you don't close on time, if you don't close because you quit your job, got divorced, leased a car the week before closing, bought furniture the week before closing, which we see all the time. Missed a credit card payment because you're so busy running around taking care of your wedding, your honeymoon, that you forgot to make your Visa payment, and all of a sudden you've got a late and now you don't qualify anymore. So all of those things go into the mix, but that's what your down payment is there to secure.
Jamie, I think you were itching for a question there.
I am. Well, we have a question from Eric, but I just have to say thank you to the two of you because I started with a simple question and that was great. Just ran with it. So we have a question from Eric, and that is, why does it take, let me get, where are you, Eric? Question. Why can you close so much quicker in other states? And that's a good question, because if I'm not mistaken, I had a cousin, I still do have that cousin. She bought a house in New Jersey. It took her 2 weeks.
Yeah. So New York is brutal. One of the challenges in New York, is simply the way the contracts are structured. So we can close pretty quickly in New York. If Alex can get you cleared to close in 3 weeks, we can have you ready in 3 weeks. Title search takes a week or two. A survey takes a little bit, maybe a week or two. So the answer is twofold. One is that people suck and don't move quickly, right? Attorneys don't respond. Things just don't get done as quickly. The other thing is contracts in New York have what's called an on or about date. So right off the bat, we presume it's going to take 30 or 45 days to get everything going. So we put dates in the contract that allow for a 30-day window. So even if we think we've got a 45-day closing period in the contract, so if we're getting into contract today, it's essentially April 1st. Happy anniversary, Jamie, tomorrow, or 2 days. If you're getting into contract, let's say April 1st, we'll have probably a May 15th closing date in there, right? 45 days seems reasonable. That closing date actually has a built-in 30-day window that neither party can push the other. So now all of a sudden, instead of 45 days, you're looking at 75 days. And then if things go wrong, it's even harder from there. So part of the answer to the question is how people move. And it's just because sellers take time to clear title, because buyers take time to get their mortgages, do a survey. Everything seems to move more slowly than it does in other states. Sorry, go ahead, Jay.
And I'll just kind of chime in on that question too. I'd say there's two reasons. Purchases versus refinance are different, especially in New York. We have the fund mortgage recording tax, which if you're refinancing a property and you want to basically transfer the mortgage recording tax from your old lender to your new lender, which depending on the size of your loan, if you're north of $200,000, mortgage size, it makes sense to you if your lender will allow it. Most of them do. But that's an added element that adds on to the transaction. So you add easily another 30 days to that because you're waiting for the other lender to get their approval to transfer it. And you're paying some legal fees in the meantime, but you're generally saving a significant amount of money on the mortgage recording fee. So that's refinances.
That applies to purchases too.
Yeah. And then the biggest challenge I ever deal with borrowers, and I get this question a lot, what's the fastest residential mortgage you ever closed? It was 7 days.
Oh.
Now, that was in North Carolina, so we didn't have a lot of the other factors. And that borrower worked in title, so she knew exactly what information I would need. It was a W-2 employee. She was a single woman. She had all of her money sitting in one bank. So the amount of documentation I needed from her, she literally had emailed to me within 5 minutes of our conversation being over. The hardest part of my job, and I tell every borrower that I work with, is getting the right information from the client. It's a very simple thing. I tell the same people that every single time, and still the hardest part. And if you want to talk about being very specific about documentation, that basically means if someone says, I need the last 2 months of your bank statements, that means not a screenshot. That means the actual statements themselves, a PDF that you can download and email to me. If the last page says, page 7 of 7 says this page is blank, you still need that page. That's the level of detail that you will need to make things move quickly. And when it comes to, here's my tax return, if you just send me the first 2 pages, that doesn't work. They need to be signed. So you actually would need, even if you keep everything digital, you will need to print them out and sign them and then send them to me and date them, because people sign them and not date them. And again, that adds to the time frame. But a lot of it is, finding those people who are motivated borrowers and who have all their ducks in a row and really, hit the go button. That's what holds the transactions up.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of the other parties that are in there.
Well, I'm going to jump in because that's really exactly. It's funny. I was going to say to you, Alex, that you don't need page 7 if it's blank, right? So,
Now,
I have a transaction we're closing probably in about a month, but we knew the transaction was going to happen. Buyer came to me. One of his good friends is his loan officer. They've known each other since they were kids. So he had been working with his loan officer before they found a house. They came to us as soon as they located the house, and we said, you know what, why don't we, it seems like you're going to move quick on this. Why don't we go ahead and order title? So we ordered title on a Monday morning. Title came back by either Wednesday or Thursday. Loan was clear to close, I think Wednesday or Thursday. So all 4 days into a transaction that hadn't been in contract yet. Negotiating the contract took a while because the seller's attorney sent me a crappy contract that was atrocious. It was a hand-generated contract as opposed to a form. A lot of fighting back and forth. It was somebody I've known for 30 years, and I was shocked at how unfair the contract was and the pressure we got to negotiate it or not negotiate it. They didn't want us to. Our clients allowed me to play poker and tell them we were going to walk away if we didn't get what we wanted. Sure enough, there are issues with the fence, the pool, and a kitchen addition. My point is, contracts were signed, I believe, the following Monday, if not that Friday or even Saturday. We were clear to close and title was in and ready before we signed contracts. So about 4 or 5 days into the transaction, from the attorney's standpoint and the mortgage broker's standpoint, we were done. Contracts were slow because of the other attorney. So we could have closed that transaction literally in a week, maybe a little more than a week, just to get all our ducks in a row, get the disclosures out from the bank, because they need another 3 days to get their final disclosures out. So let's say 10 days, 15 days. Things can happen quickly. They just usually don't. So if everybody is upfront and lets the parties know what they need, there is no reason that a New York closing can't happen in 2 or 3 weeks.
And that
right,
there's
so
a lot of
hold-
documentation that has to be sent out, like the closing disclosure from the lender has to hit the borrower at least 3 days before closing. So again, you're adding to the clock, the shot clock with any things like that.
All right, and I'm going to just answer, Eric, I think that kind of helps answer your question, but the other answer to that question is because you got to talk to these 2 guys and you're going to hear all the different things that they're going to tell you that you have to do or didn't do or going to do. But let's change the topic for a little bit and just change the subject from a little bit from the problem of buying a home or selling a home or so to what's the current climate. And if you just indulge in me in a minute and talk about, we went through a pandemic. So that changed the world. There was a mass migration out of New York City to be at Long Island and the other suburbs. We encountered things like social distancing. I remember driving and watching houses that were for sale with lines of people outside 6 feet apart, allowing only one person at a time. So it was difficult to sell the house. There was a high demand. There was a low inventory. All of these things added to soaring rates. And you heard stories of people buying houses for well over, be it $100,000 over asking price. Is that still happening?
A little bit. So we are still seeing either at ask or over ask. So sellers are not budging off their asking prices, and depending on where the house is, if it's still a popular area, they're going over ask. I'm still seeing, in that $700,000 and $800,000 market out here on the island, and in Westchester, Manhattan's a different story. We are seeing 3, 4, 5% over ask, which isn't the pandemic levels of 10% over ask. The same thing happened in 2004, by the way. This is not new, but the challenge now is, without inventory, you just don't have a lot of room to push back. So the inventory has not changed. Rates are, we erased in a year, maybe a little less than a year, we erased 25% 5 years of declining interest rates, right? So we went back to 1999 levels, essentially overnight, or really 1997 interest rates overnight. So it's a different environment, but the pressure is still on buyers. It hasn't really eased. There's not a lot for them to look at. And when they do go, there's still 5 or 6 offers in a weekend at least. So it's better.
And just add to that, Seth, too, like you can't fight against someone who's irrational. So
Yeah.
if you have a seller who thinks, and I had this recently, a seller wanted $900,000 for their house because all their neighbors sold their houses for $900,000. Well, the neighbors' houses are all upgraded, brand new kitchens, like completely gut renovated. I mean, these are 1950s homes, so they've got some years on them. Theirs was lipstick on the pig, if you want to call it that. And I just looked at the home inspection, and again, I'm not a contractor, but I've seen enough of these, easily $150,000 worth of work to even get it up to being kind of like a place you'd want to live in. And, you know, but the buyers that I was working with, I said, you need to walk away from this. And his wife was invested. That she's like, I got friends who live in this neighborhood. This is the neighborhood I want to live in. Again, that's where the emotion versus the rational thinking is. Yeah, you could buy that house, but it's going to be painful from both a financial and every other aspect that you're going to run into. The lender definitely is going to have an issue with the condition of the property. And again, if that's what came up on the home inspection, guess what you're going to find when they move the furniture away from all the walls where they've been hiding things.
Yeah. Oh,
It's there, and it's going to be a lot
Yeah.
more expensive. And something that Seth was talking about earlier is, even if you have a new construction home that you're buying, there will always be things that pop up that you will need to address. Sometimes they're little, sometimes they're big. And I use, again, another example that I had of someone who bought a house. Was an old house that was knocked down. They left one wall up for tax purposes, so it's still considered the old tax base if you want to play that game. New construction. The contractor ran out of money about halfway through and kind of finished things on the cheap, which meant drywalling over where the fireplace was supposed to be, and not actually finishing that, or having outlets that they put in that actually weren't attached to anything, but they put a piece of furniture in front of it when the home inspection was done. So it's harder to pick up on these things. The drain in between where the washer and dryer were on the first floor, there was a drain there, but if you go down in the basement, it doesn't go anywhere. It's just the pipe sticking out of the ceiling. So these things are there. Again, they're little problems until they become big problems, but I would make sure that you have excess funds at least available to you. And I use the old adage with people, you can't eat your house. So if you put every dollar you have into, I tell people all the time that, oh, I've paid off my mortgage, it's the greatest thing I've ever done. And I said, well, you have no money in the bank and no liquidity above and beyond that. Why would you want to do that? And they said, well, that's always been my dream, to pay it off. And I said, well, in the right circumstances, that makes sense. But if you had a mortgage at 2.5% and you could make the payments comfortably, and you just took all of your cash and wiped that out, now you can't. It's much harder to get that money back out if you need it for something, and it's going to be a lot more expensive to do so. So again, it's what is your plan versus what feels good at the moment and doing.
Yeah, it's funny, right, Alex? You see it more than anybody really. But an interesting thing is that if you borrow 80% of the purchase price at the time that you close, you are considered the American dream perfect buyer. If you ask for 80% of the purchase price in cash 2 days after you close, you're basically considered to be a drug addict, degenerate gambler. They're like, why on earth would you need to take 80% of the cash out of your house? So very different process when you're trying to take out money for anything later, whether it's repairs, bad inspection report, rushed inspection report, no inspection report because you thought waiving it would be a good idea. It's really a challenge, not knowing what you're getting into and not having reserves. It's probably one of the biggest challenges we see. And when you start off with your realtor looking at houses that are 600,000, they're like, there's nothing in that range, but for 750 we have this one, and don't worry, you guys qualify for it. You've now left yourself stretched really, really thin, which again.
All right, so I want to change the speed again one more time and move over to commercial real estate. We had, again, pandemic, and we all left the office and worked from home. I'm going to call it the end of the pandemic, though COVID's not over, is now we're on a cycle of back to the office. What's happening in the world of commercial real estate these days?
jump in on that one first. I'd say there's a few things there, and there's a lot of different definitions for what commercial real estate is. So you find different brackets, whether it be multifamily housing or office buildings or industrial buildings. There's very different things happening with all of those. If you want to look at from, high level investment grade apartment buildings, people need a place to live. You're probably going to have higher occupancy on those versus some of the office buildings where people have changed strategies, or, maybe more work from home still, or remote. I've had a couple companies on, Long Island that I know of that, majority of their employees strictly work from home now. You can do that with some, you can't with others. I think coming is, for those of you not familiar with commercial real estate financing, it is a whole nother world than residential. It is not the same animal. It's not even remotely close in terms of how the structures work, how the conditions work, and sort of what's involved. But, I saw some article from Scott Reckler from RXR the other day, and he was sort of talking about, it's roughly about a $1.5 trillion of commercial real estate loans that are going to mature in the next 3 years. And they all locked in at much lower rates than what we have now. And, most commercial real estate loans are done, call it a 5, 7, or 10-year term. They might have the monthly payments based off a longer period of time, but normally you're getting a balloon, which basically means you either have to pay off the loan or refinance it or sell the building at that point. So your new world is, close to double the interest rates. So what does that mean for the tenants? And the owners of those properties? Again, that's sort of that changing thing that's going to be hitting us over the next couple of years. That's still coming. And a lot of those lenders, who were doing them, you found a lot of the mid-regional banks were the biggest players in those markets for lending. If you want to talk about the real giants, a lot of them were doing, different types of secured loans that they were selling on the secondary market. The ones being held on balance sheets were a lot of the mid-tier regional banks had a huge play in that. And again, a lot of those are in a different place now than they were, 12 months, 2 years ago, in terms of what they want to do. So I think there's another shoe that's still going to drop and coming up that I don't think as many people are aware of. That's certainly a completely different marketplace than it was, prior to COVID starting.
Yeah, I agree.
Wow, I was going to say that you just said all that. I would have been impressed that I actually answered the question.
Yeah, no, it's a different market. It's really going to be a challenge for sellers. But I think even on top of that, Alex, you've got still the rent roll issue, right? So you've got the market changing from a rate perspective, and income from rent rolls is going to be down significantly. Although what's really odd is Manhattan rents aren't changing. So we're going to see, the next few years are really going to be interesting.
A lot of those come back to, and this is, again, something that I think is missed on a regular basis, whether it's residential or commercial finance, is what is your long-term plan and what are you planning on doing versus you came to me and said, I need a loan and I'm giving you one. And I think that's where a lot of the lenders sort of miss. And I'll use two different examples. Let's use one residential, one commercial. So the residential one is this is a previous place that I worked. I get one of those panicked phone calls from a client. I'm buying a house in Florida. We're supposed to close in 3 days. Yeah. There's a problem with the certificate of occupancy and I have no out of my contract. Mm-hmm. Can you do a loan for me? And I said, there's no way on earth that I can close a residential mortgage in 3 days, let alone one that already has a certificate of occupancy problem. And I said, let's hit the pause button. I see that you live in Texas. Why are you buying a house in Florida? And there was like this brief pause, and the woman says, my husband's retiring from his job in 6 months. We're buying this house in Florida as our future forever home. And once he retires, we're going to sell the house in Texas and pay off the mortgage in Florida.
Cash out.
And I said, all right, well, your first issue is you don't need a mortgage, you need a bridge loan, because you're paying all those fees that you would have for the transaction in Florida for something that you're renting for 6 months. You're renting that loan for 6 months. So we were able to structure a bridge loan for her, and I did it that day for the amount that she needed. It was $400,000, which, it's still $400,000, but in her, personal net worth made that an easy transaction for me to do. Basically tied it to a securities portfolio that was hers. There's no prepayment penalty. There's no fees. She could still close. She could solve the CO problem or certificate of occupancy problem after she closed. And I told her, I was like, this is the danger. Like, you may never get that fixed. And then you have to deal with that when you look to sell the property. But if that's what you really need, she was going to lose a $200,000 deposit.
In
So
Florida,
you can solve for those.
in other states, they don't work like in New York. So in New York, if any of you have had an awful real estate experience or heard of somebody, down payments can get tied up, and the sale or purchase of a house can get tied up for 2 years without batting an eye. So if the seller doesn't, let me just a couple of quick things and then I'll leave it at that. But if a seller doesn't want to move, so one of the challenges is New York is extremely difficult to get a judge involved, right? Other states, I think you can walk into court in 2 weeks, have an answer, a little more like Judge Judy, where somebody just makes a decision. In New York, if you are a seller and you decide not to sell your house, despite the fact that you have turned a buyer's life upside down, kids who have to move out of an apartment, now their rent's going to double. There is, from a practical standpoint, not from a legal standpoint, from a practical standpoint, there is nothing you can do about it. So I've had clients that this has happened to. We've had just before the pandemic, I had an older lady who just decided, I don't want to sell. We went back and forth for about 5 or 6 months, despite me trying to explain to my client that the best thing for them to do was just walk away. The house was a good deal. It was where they wanted it. They banged their head against the wall for months. She wasn't moving. In New York, you are not getting yourself into a court before a judge to say, Judge, I want to exercise my legal rights to specific performance and force this sweet little old lady to sell her house. The judge is going to go like, can you find another house? I can, but this one is here. It's near my mother-in-law. They don't care. So you'll spend 2 years and $40,000 or $50,000 in legal fees, and I'm not kidding about that, to find out that they're not going to allow you to force the person out of their house. The flip side is, if you're a seller and you're trying to force a buyer to move quicker, it's very difficult. So we can pound the table and we can threaten and we can do things, but essentially, as the seller's attorney, I have the buyer's down payment in my escrow account. I know I'm not giving it back if there's a challenge, but I also know I can't release it to my client. So if we have a battle, if we have a buyer who can't come to the table because they're slow or because they can't get their mortgage or the gift from the parents didn't come through, the best thing I can really hope for is to negotiate part of the down payment, give it, to my seller as to cover their expenses and as just a makeup in case we don't sell the house for the same price. But the best thing you can do in New York is move on as quickly as possible. The litigation system here is a train wreck. So that said, one of the really important things to keep in mind is if you have, if you know anybody, and for us, it's if we have clients that are selling in New York and buying in another state, if they have a contract in Florida to close in 3 or 4 weeks, that contract is hard and fast. If they don't close in that time frame, they lose their deposit. So if I have somebody that's selling here, one of the first things we ask them is, where are you going? What are you doing? And if they don't already own a house someplace else, it is an enormous effort and takes painstaking care to make sure that we give them the leeway that they need wherever they're going and tight enough timeframes here in New York so that they don't get burned. And they have to have a contingency plan, because the best laid plans in New York can go sideways in a heartbeat for a host of reasons, right? It could be, I can't tell you how many files I get where the 1979 mortgage wasn't satisfied of record. And they're like, no, I paid that off. Okay, but it was with, ABC, which is not a joke, ABC Bank, which was Amnet, and they're out of business. Now I have to try and find somebody in the banking system that can get me a satisfaction from a bank that's been gone for 30 years or more. It's not happening in 15 days. So there are all kinds of things that can come up. People don't realize certificates of occupancy are very often not closed out, especially if there was a pool and a pool fence. So those things can hold you up from selling and cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in another state when you thought everything was good.
All right,
Hey,
so
Seth,
we
I'm
have
gonna cut you off for 1 second because I see we've got a couple questions. I don't know if that that's where you were going.
I was just going there. So
I'm gonna just give one last comment before we jump to the questions, because I see Chris and Keith had a couple questions. One is, I don't know if you've kind of gathered this, but Seth and I are very passionate about what we do. I love educating people and making them more dangerous and more painful for another banker to deal with, because I've explained a bunch of stuff to them that they should be asking. But I think when it comes down to it, not all things are created equal, whether it be your lender, your counsel, or anyone else that you're dealing with. And I think, to get back to where we started, understanding kind of what you're getting yourself into, whether it be, a lender who tells you, I've got a 4% interest rate, and then you find out that's because you're paying 5 points to get it. And you go, what are points? And that's sort of the point of, again, dealing with someone who knows what they're doing. And those are fees, by the way. But I'd say, you know, kind of getting back to the, again, where we started is have a plan, know what your limits are, know that you're dealing with people that you've already, you know and can figure out, staying away from someone who doesn't know what they're doing, which is harder to figure out sometimes. But and I see the questions, and I don't know, Jamie, if you wanted to jump over to this.
Absolutely. Let's work backwards.
Yeah.
Chris, we're going to hold yours for last because you gave us that opportunity. So let's start with Keith. You had a question about mixed use buildings and financing.
I'll jump into that one.
Yeah.
Mixed use buildings are certainly able to be done.
Let him ask the question first. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, I see. Oh, I saw. I'm reading it on the screen, but go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was looking into a mixed use building in, you know, one of the towns here on the island, which was, you know, 2 or 3 like little professional office spaces and an apartment upstairs. And of course, I know the rent roll is part of it, but how challenging is that from both your perspectives?
I think from a financing standpoint, there's 2 different ways a lender can look at those. It depends on who the lender is. Depending on, you know, if it's a smaller, maybe 2 tenants that are in there, even if they got longer term leases or things like that, the lender's going to want to know how long those leases are for, how long have they been in place for, and is it somebody they consider what they call a credit tenant versus just, you know, the mom and pop type of business. Is it a Dunkin' Donuts who's your tenant, who I kind of know is going to make the payments?
Right.
Versus someone who rents an individual apartment or, you know, a standalone private company that we don't really have a whole bunch of credit background on. So the 2 ways they can look at it is saying, all right, here's the rent roll and how much money this property's been generating, and we can kind of work a financing number based off of that. Some of the other lenders will say, since we don't have a super long track record or guarantee of the tenants that are there, it's going to be based on your income.
Right.
And your personal net worth, and how does that play in? If those tenants don't make the payments, can you still pay us?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, from a legal standpoint, the mixed use stuff, really just you need to make sure your contract is negotiated so that you have protection for first of all, due diligence, right? We try to give you a 5 or a 10-day due diligence period, if not longer, just so you can check out the income and expenses prior, so you can do an inspection, find out whether or not you need an environmental inspection. It will depend what the mixed use is. I mean, I just did one where my client didn't bother to tell me that the property, simple, storefront, Queens, 2 units up above, looked great. I asked him a whole bunch of questions. He told me what was there. I was researching online, so we can do a lot of research online before you buy, before you even get into contract.
Yeah.
On this one, nothing showed up online about the prior use. I had happened to have been scrolling through prior satellite imagery and saw a sign from an old image that showed it was a shoe repair, not a shoe repair. It was a dry cleaner before it was a shoe repair facility. Immediately now I have chemical issues, and sure enough, we had leaking fluorocarbons, PFCs,
And all the other fun stuff.
Wow.
That's in
Yeah.
that required
Okay.
drilling, and so disaster. So all of that needs to be negotiated into the contract. Otherwise, you are at the mercy of whatever comes your way. So it's not that it's harder to finance or harder to buy. There's just more that
It's
you need
more
to do to
involved, more
protect
due
yourself.
diligence. That's definitely. And then Keith, the other thing is, you know, what's around you. So if you have a great property, but they just built a gas station on the corner that's 50 yards from you, and you're downhill, they have a leak and stuff leaks into your property, it's now your problem.
Yeah.
You own
Okay.
it, and you're going to have to resolve it. I think, you know, finding those old tanks or things like that, there's a lot more due diligence that goes into those, just because, you know, some of the mixed use, if you want to call it, inventory that's out there, some of them are older. It's just understanding what's been in there previously that could pop up later to kind of bite you. You know, if everything's clean and great, I mean, it could be a good investment. It's just knowing that if my tenants don't pay me, how am I still paying my, you know, outstanding obligations on that?
Right. Okay.
So
Thank you.
Keith, the best answer to your question is, if you're interested in acquiring this property, is to engage the services of these 2 guys, Seth and
All right,
Alex.
Jamie. Yes, I get it.
It's to make sure you're really to make sure you're prepared.
And Keith, the
Of
one
course.
thing I see a lot of people do is, if you're buying that, set up a separate entity to own it.
Yes,
see a
yes,
lot of
that I
people
know.
own
Yes.
it, you know, personally, and I'm always like, please don't do that.
Yeah, no.
You
This
try
is
to push
exactly
that liability as far from yourself as possible.
Yes, that I know. That I do know. Thank you.
All right. We'll talk more
So,
later, Keith.
The
Dan,
estate question, let me just, because there are two really good questions in there. The estate one's more of a comment. You know, that there's maybe two or three things to go with that. One is speed. I answered it in the chat box there, but one is speed, right? So the downside of people doing things the way they've always done it is taking their time and ordering title when they've got a mortgage commitment. I was talking about this before, right? Somebody said in the corner there that I think it was Keith, that your daughter was buying a property, it was from an estate, but they didn't have clear title. It happens all the time.
Yeah. It was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare.
But
Yep.
that nightmare, you know, if title is in within 3 days of the contract being ordered, and if the contract is negotiated properly, the best worst case scenario is you go, all right, this is a shit show, let's cut and run. And now you're a week into the process. Okay, you spent $500, title reports, appraisal, whatever it might have been, but you're out, you move on.
Yeah.
To find that out 3 months down the road is not fun.
Yeah. And it cost her a point in the mortgage rate at the end of the day. So yeah, it was a
So
nightmare.
if the contract was, okay. People,
Yeah, enough said, but yeah, I just
If
to
the
call out
contract is
people to,
yeah, if the contract's prepared, so everybody puts the attorneys and the mortgage people under a tremendous amount of pressure. And I go home at night and like, this is what I complain to my family about. Like, I'm not allowed to do my job. We're the one in the, this isn't a woe is me thing. We're the ones making the least amount of money in the transaction and the most at stake in terms of what our job does. Right. So the
Right.
realtors who make 40 times what we make, especially in Manhattan, when they'll have $300,000 commission checks at stake, they want things to move quickly. But
yeah,
if the contract's not negotiated properly, if it's negotiated properly, we actually have clauses in there that would allow the seller to have time to cure their problem, limit the amount of time, give us the ability to decide how much time they have and what the consequences are, which would mean that they have, let's say 60 days, but not past the expiration of my rate lock, which means now take your time, cure the problem, just know that you're paying my expenses.
yeah,
Huge difference. So that happens a lot. And if the contract's negotiated well, the buyer needs to be covered for their costs or have the right to walk away because maybe they got to get a kid in school and they don't have the ability.
yeah,
And then you can craft things that allow you to close, even if certain parts of title aren't clear, depending on what it is that needs to be done. And you hold a ton of money of escrow in escrow. Same thing with an open permit. You can draft a contract that allows you to close and still keeps the buyer protected if we know what the ultimate worst case scenario is. You know, so yeah, just
Keith,
take
that answer the question?
yes, definitely. Thank you.
I think
All
Chris
right.
had one last one, and I think we're
Well,
almost out
before,
of time.
just to go, before that, Dan had his hand up. So let Dan go and then we'll
I
finish.
did
with
have my
Chris's
hand up.
question.
I think my question may take us down another rabbit hole. So I'll present it, but understand that we're at our time frame.
Exactly.
And neither of you may even know the implications, but a lot has been said about Governor Hochul and low-income housing coming to New York State. She passed it in her budget. Everybody's up in arms over it. Some people are up in arms over it. I've heard discussions that it's going to affect housing prices all across Nassau County, some in Suffolk because of what she's doing. Any comments?
I mean, there's already some here, so
Yeah,
I mean, it's not like it's a new thing.
I have a good legal solution. Just stop.
I mean,
watching.
lenders actually really like those loans because the government's making the payments. I mean, it's a simple math.
But they said, I don't know if it's I heard that this go around, they're going to push for them into areas like Plainview, Port Washington, and it's going to really affect overall home values as this continues to go up.
They're doing it. I mean, right, Jamie, right up the road from you guys in between where we both live, they're putting in a big development. I think a lot of that is, unless it's really, so low income, okay, let's just say this really quick. The definition of these things typically they don't end up going where they're supposed to go. So the people that they're supposed to help, they don't usually end up helping. So when they put up low and moderate income housing, it's usually not benefiting the people who really need it because who can still afford it? So it's low income housing, which on Long Island right now probably means a $500,000 house. So, we all have to put up with the riffraff that comes with a $500,000 starter house. That's kind of evil,
All right.
but it's also sort of true.
All right, so there's a lot we can discuss about that. As you say, we're running out of time so very quickly, Chris's question was, do you have kind of a guide for first time buyers,
Simple,
something that's
Alex
already
can
in.
tell you from a mortgage standpoint, but I'll do this really quickly. The most important thing you can do is have your team ready in advance. I am dumbfounded how many people don't know an attorney, an accountant, a mortgage banker, a realtor, an inspector. Have your team, which can often just be one point person lined up. So whether it's your mortgage person who has a group, and everybody does, right, who has a group that you trust, and interview the hell out of them. Don't just say, oh, my buddy told me that you're great, so I'm going to use you. That's great. We love to hear that. It feels good. Ask questions, and if they won't answer them, go away.
All right,
I would
anybody?
second that. There's a lot of good informational guides out there for first-time home buyers. Again, and the more education you have and the more you understand what you're getting yourself into, the better. If anybody ever needs those, I can always, get that out to someone. But there's a variety of different lenders that actually have pretty good ones online. I think, again, the preparation and advanced planning before you're diving into any of those transactions being the most important thing.
Does anybody have any last short answered questions?
I have a quick comment for any of you, particularly with kids who may have less established credit buying homes. Tell your kids to pay off, and you guys too, as adults, to pay your credit card bills twice a month, if not more, before you apply for credit of any type. So paying your credit card bills at the end of the month actually does not help your credit and can hurt.
Just don't close the credit cards, even if you pay
Don't
them
close
off.
them.
Leave the line amounts open,
Yeah.
because that actually improves your credit score.
Right. But
All
pay
right,
them,
so
pay them constantly, not just every month.
And that's an interesting point. That's it's credit. We had a whole conversation earlier about credit, and we can go into that as another lengthy conversation.
Yeah.
But watch your credit. In other words, as Alex said to me the other day, don't go out and buy that Maserati before you buy the house. All right. So with that, I just want to, if I can, my 2 cents worth in closing is the message is get your ducks in order, be prepared. And the way to do that is to work with the right people to, in advance, as Seth said, have your partners, have your lawyer, your banker, your title company, have all these things ready. Well, I guess title company can't, but have these things ready in advance so that when you find that house, you have all your people in place to do it, as opposed to the old way, which was, I found a house, now I gotta find a lawyer. So have these guys in place. And then the second piece is, when talking to these guys, I really think that one of the things Alex and Seth have both pointed out is the old Sandler rule: ask why. Just refer back to Alex's story of the family from Texas to Florida. If you understand why they're doing something or why they're asking something, then you can understand you can then provide them with the best answer. So get those ducks in order and be prepared to ask why. I got positive feedback from everybody, so I hope you all enjoyed this. I found this to be very informative, very useful. And if anybody needs any contact information, as you see Seth or Alex, the best thing is to contact me, and I'll make sure I get you the proper introductions. So with that, thank you for joining us in another educational workshop, and see you next month.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Now, thank you for joining us today in an educational workshop on the pulse of the real estate industry. If there's 2 things I learned from today's workshop, it is to have your ducks in order. And what we mean by that is to engage your banker and your lawyer first, have them in line, all ready to go. You can even go and get your mortgage pre-approved, so you know how much you can spend or how. Thank you for joining us in today's educational workshop on the pulse of the real estate industry. If there's something I learned from today's, thank you for joining us in today's educational workshop. The one thing I definitely learned from this is by having my ducks in order, meaning going to my banker and my lawyer first before I buy my house, so that I can have a pre-approved mortgage, so I know what I'm comfortable spending. As well as having my lawyer ready, that when I do find the house of my choice, that I have everything ready to go, including such things as title and contract, and knowing what I need to know. Having a checklist, filling out all those things. Like I said, I don't like that either. Thank you for joining us in today's educational workshop on the pulse of the real estate industry. We learned some very interesting things about what's happening in the current real estate environment. And what I think we should all take from this is the message is when you're buying or selling a house, have your ducks in order. What that means is before you find that house of your of your banker and your lawyer, so that you can have your mortgage pre-approved, so you know what you can spend, as well as your lawyer ready to go with things like title and contract. And then the other thing to learn is make sure that you ask questions and understand why, and make sure that your banker and your lawyer are asking you why, so that they understand what your purpose and what your needs are. So with that, again, thank you for joining us. Look for us next month. Watch for, so thank you for joining us, and watch for next month's educational workshop on marketing. It's the 4th Thursday of the month, and watch for our emails. Have a great day.